Brandon Novak is one of several professional skateboarders that dominated MTV in the mid-2000s. From becoming a pro skater in his teens to being featured on shows and movies such as Jackass, Viva La Bam, and CKY, Novak had all of the right characteristics to launch a successful career similar to some of his co-stars. Instead, the path he ultimately went down would be filled with decades of constant struggle and self-destructive behavior. In fact, when you learn just how bad things got, it makes you wonder how he survived as long as he did. For many people, Brandon Novak was simply another happy character having fun with his friends on TV. But the truth of what was going on behind the scenes was far worse than what most people knew. This is the story of Brandon Novak. Brandon Novak was born on December 10, 1978 in Baltimore, Maryland, and grew up in a household with an interesting dynamic. His mother was a nuclear physicist at Mercer Hospital, and his father was a struggling drug addict who eventually died due to his addiction when Brandon was still a child. Despite the peculiar dynamic of his household, Brandon did have a relatively decent childhood, which mostly consisted of skateboarding with his friends. Now, pretty much any kid who picks up a skateboard at least briefly has a goal of becoming a professional skateboarder. And when Brandon first started skating at age 7, he wasn't any different. However, unlike the majority of kids, Brandon's skateboarding was actually good. He was so hooked on skateboarding that there wasn't a doubt in his mind that he would eventually get sponsored.
And I got my first skateboard at the age of 7, and the night that my mother put me to bed, she said, "Brandon, what would you like me to do with your skateboard?" And I said, "I want it in bed with me." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because if I die, I want it to go with me." The moment that that board had touched my hand, I knew I was gonna be a professional skateboarder.
He began spending all of his free time skating and completely dedicated himself to getting better. Luckily for him, it didn't take long for his hard work to pay off. When he was still a kid, Novak happened to start skating with Bucky Lazick, a professional skateboarder who was one of the top pros of that era. Since Bucky was also from Baltimore, he took Novak under his wing and acted as a mentor for his skating. At that point, Brandon was already a talented skateboarder, but this mentorship accelerated his progression even faster. By the time he was 14, his incredible skill level allowed him to catch the attention of Tony Hawk, which then led him to landing a spot on the Powell Peralta skate team. Soon after that, Brandon became the first skateboarder to be sponsored by Gatorade and was even doing commercials with top athletes such as Michael Jordan. At just 14, his childhood dream was already starting to come to fruition. Unfortunately, this dream would be short-lived. Perhaps influenced by his father, or maybe just the people he put himself around, Brandon began experimenting with drugs at an early age. He started off by casually smoking and drinking with friends, but soon progressed to much harder substances. Now, even in a subculture like skateboarding, using hard substances isn't widely accepted, and it didn't take long for his habits to start causing a conflict with his skating career. After finding some of his paraphernalia on a skate tour, the older skaters on the team, including Tony Hawk, gave a 16-year-old Brandon an ultimatum: go to rehab and get clean, or get kicked off the team forever. Surprisingly, without hesitation, Brandon chose to quit the team on the spot. Despite spending the majority of his childhood dreaming about and working towards becoming a professional skateboarder, just like that, he had given it all up. In his mind, he was simply having fun like the other teens were, and skateboarding needed him more than he needed skateboarding. However, as he would soon find out, that was far from the case, and the issues of his reality were just beginning to show. Growing up skating in Baltimore, Brandon would often make trips up to Philly to go to skate the park there. Since he was such a talented skateboarder, naturally he became close friends with some of the other skateboarders who would visit the park. Well, it just so happened that one of those skateboarders was a young kid named Bam Margera. Novak and Bam were around the same age. They skated the same things and were both very good at skating. Over the years, they became great friends and would even make trips to go stay with each other and skate. Sadly, when Novak started getting into heavier substances, this pretty much stopped altogether. Bam would show up to the skate park and Novak was nowhere to be found, essentially disappearing from the skate scene overnight. Well, as time went on, even though Novak quit, Bam continued his skate career and began getting some major sponsors. Shortly after that, he then started to transition to media and was filming movies, TV shows, and commercials. The lives of the two friends had basically become opposites, with Novak slipping into substances and Bam rocketing into a life of fame and money. The thing is, throughout this period, Bam never forgot about their friendship. Although he was basically becoming an overnight celebrity, he would still ask about Novak whenever he was in town. And like a true friend, when Bam heard that he was struggling with substance abuse, he invited Novak to come live with him to try to get clean.
One day I just disappeared off the face of the earth due to my addiction. And he's asking about me, and they're like, well, you know, we see him, he pops in occasionally, he's on heroin, there's not much we can do. And with that, Bam left his number, and he said, look, let Novak know if he wants to get clean, he can come live with me.
The goal was to get him out of Baltimore and into a new environment where he would be around better people who had his best interest. As simple as it was, this act of kindness arguably saved Novak's life. See, after moving in with Bam, Novak was shot into the spotlight right alongside him. He was in many of the same TV shows and movies, and because of that, he started making more money than he had ever made before. In his early 20s, he was already a multimillionaire. He was traveling the world, getting paid for appearances, and was living a life many people could only dream of. In a few short months, he had transitioned from a homeless drug addict to a millionaire TV personality. And at first glance, everything about it seemed like an amazing success story. However, as great as it may have appeared on the outside, there was still one major problem. Novak had never fully overcome his addiction. Throughout the entire time he was living with Bam, Novak simply wasn't able to maintain his sobriety. He would have certain periods where he was doing better, but even with the multiple rehab centers and clinics, he was never able to stop using for good. This would cause major tensions in his friendships, since most of the people around him desperately wanted him to get better, but were frustrated with his constant relapses. He would be late to filmings, he would miss various trips, and he would show up to events completely spaced out, all while constantly lying to his friends about his sobriety.
Seriously, just
No, I completely will tell you.
take it all out.
I completely will tell you.
Take the whole thing out. Take it all out.
Trust me, I won't come up here.
I know, dude. I'm just saying, man. If you're doing that at my house, I seriously gotta kick you
I
out.
will leave.
Things were beginning to spiral out of control, and Novak's friends and family were starting to lose hope. To make matters worse, Novak's time in the spotlight would only last for so long. As the years passed and Brandon steadily burned bridges, he would slowly get fewer and fewer opportunities. The movies stopped getting filmed, the TV shows ended, and the paid appearances stopped happening. The only thing that continued throughout the years was his addiction, which had no clear end in sight. Novak had somehow found himself in a position where the flash of fame he had experienced was over. His addiction was at its all-time worst, and his friends and family had been pushed to their breaking point. As bad as Brandon was when he was strung out, when he was sober, he was actually a really good guy. He was extremely talented, he was smart, and he had a lot of potential. People genuinely wanted him to get sober, and his friends and family had literally spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on his treatments over the years. The thing is, it's hard to help somebody who isn't ready to be helped. The qualities that made Novak so likable were the same qualities that made it hard for him to get better. When someone is that successful at a young age, it's hard for them to lower their ego enough to get the help they need. This was a major issue with Brandon, and it's the main thing that held him back for so long.
The more outrageous, the more outlandish my antics were, the more in demand I became. The higher my ratings came, the more I made financially.
He had been to over a dozen rehab centers and countless outpatient treatments. And although he learned some things, like many other users, he thought he knew better and never fully accepted the help he was getting. Eventually though, he was forced to come to terms with reality. Brandon's years of substance abuse had caused a toll on himself and those around him. His employment opportunities disappeared, his friends had all but given up, and after dealing with his addiction for years, his mother finally decided to kick him out of her house and serve him with a restraining order. All of these things combined left him homeless, broke, and alone. But in some ways, it was exactly what he needed. Having spent years and years letting substances ruin his life, he was completely defeated in every way possible. And after realizing he had no other option, he decided he was ready to actually get help.
The pain became great enough that I became willing to do whatever you told me to do, and I came to this realization in that basement that I possessed that job for 20 years that consisted of knowing everything, to coming to the understanding that what I do know is that I don't know.
With everything stacked against him, Novak was beaten down just badly enough that when he checked himself into rehab for the 13th time, something finally clicked. He was at such an all-time low that for whatever reason, the same information he was given on the 12 previous tries had finally started to resonate with him. He actually started to respond to the advice being given to him, and his perception suddenly started to change. This new perspective completely shifted the way he lived. After successfully completing a 90-day rehab program, he then continued on to a sober living house. And after staying there for a while, he went back out into the real world. Except for this time, he was finally sober. In the following years, Novak was able to write another book, release more skateboarding videos, and start a successful speaking career where he shares his journey with others. Today, he even owns several sober living houses where he helps people in recovery transition back into society. Brandon Novak could have easily become another celebrity that eventually passed away from an overdose and was simply forgotten about. But somehow, he managed to completely turn his life around for the better. It's hard to know why it took so many years and so many attempts to do it, but after seeing what he's gone through and where he's been able to end up, his story is definitely an inspiring one.